Hello and welcome to Still a Consciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, your host. And this week, as every week, we're going to talk about AI and some of the things that are going on. And this week, I am especially happy to say that we've got back one of our favorite and most admired analysts, commentators, and thinkers on AI, Alondra Nelson. Alondra is the Harold F. Linder professor at the Institute of Advanced Study and Independent Research Center in Princeton, New Jersey. Dr. Nelson served as Deputy Assistant to the President, Joe Biden, and Acting Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. It's great to have you back, Alondra.
Always good to be with you, David.
So there's so much to talk about, and you've been prolific in your writing and your comments. But I'd like to sort of start at maybe, I don't know, 35,000 feet, and then we can drill down in any direction you want to go. But we're now, 9, 10 months into the Trump administration. And so we have a picture of what U.S. AI policy is. And it's different from AI policy in the Biden administration in a number of key respects. President Trump has around him a number of folks from the technology community. And I think it's fair to say that they have been nudging him in a direction that might be called regulatory light, might be called laissez-faire, but essentially a kind of leave it to us direction where the tech community says we've got this and the government should stay out, with a couple of carve-outs. And I'm just wondering how you think that's all going.
So I think, David, that you have fallen for the mirage of deregulation that the Trump administration
Oh, no.
says it's doing. I think that many of us have fallen for it, and it is a performance. I mean, I think that if you look at what the administration is doing around AI, it's maybe not formal regulation in the sense of a Trump administration Lena Khan who's leaning on big tech companies. But what's clear is that the Trump administration is leaning into shaping from the executive branch every place in the pipeline of that in the AI stack, in the AI pipeline. So, we can talk about all of the trade warfare that's happening around critical minerals. That's AI policy. We can talk about the semiconductor chip export control. That's AI policy. Whether or not, I haven't been able to track whether or not we're charging $100,000 for H-1B visas and for expertise in science and technology. In addition to, things like wanting equity buybacks in companies like Intel. So it is something that, Trump AI policy performs itself as being laissez-faire and deregulatory. But I think that relative to, going to compare it to both, even I think the prior Trump administration, the Biden administration, and even the Obama administration, it has been a very long time, probably since, the early 20th century, in which a government has leaned in so much into a particular industry. So it technically is formally deregulatory if we're literally talking about, FTC, SEC, but it actually is pretty muscular and I think hyperactive in its intervention in the AI industry space.
Well, I think that's an interesting distinction because it sort of depends on how you look at it. You're absolutely right about the role. And it looks kind of like, I don't know, it looks kind of like the president thinks AI is a hot stock and he wants to own it, and he's sort of, let's own some of these companies and let's, sort of get the upside and let's give us an advantage over some of our competitors out there. But when it comes to certain areas of regulatory activity, like safety or privacy, then you'd acknowledge that their view there is kind of like, oh no, we're not going to get into that because that's contrary to their overall policies, or it's consistent with their overall policies.
There, I would quibble a little bit as well, David. I didn't.
Oh
Were you
boy,
gunning for a fight this morning?
I'm off to a terrible start. What did you have for breakfast? Well, no, go on.
I would say a couple of things. So if we think about the president's AI action plan, which is was a policy white paper, and what gave it teeth were the 3 executive orders that came with it. So one of these executive orders was around so-called woke AI, and not wanting, sort of left radical, all these in scare quotes, bias in AI. But the fundamental issue is a technical issue around bias in AI systems. And it is just the mirror image of what the Biden administration had been asking for vis-a-vis forms of bias and discrimination in algorithms. And so, again, it calls itself something different. But then in this instance, the question of bias, I mean, I was both when candidate Trump was on the campaign trail, and then also with this executive order, my initial response was like, thank goodness. Can we agree that bias systems are not good for anybody, that we need to have more rigor and evaluation around these AI systems? And so, again, in our very polarized political space, these things masquerade and call themselves different things. But I think this is one instance where it's the same. I think safety, there I would agree with you. I was at the Paris AI Action Summit, and I was there when JD Vance gave his speech about AI. And the line that he used was something like, we need to stop with this hand wringing about safety. And so that was, I think, his first international speech, and it was one of the administration's first articulations about AI policy on the global stage. So that was clearly, AI safety, in quotes, however we understand that, was in the crosshairs. And we've since renamed the USAI Safety Institute to, I think it's the Security and Innovation Institute. So there's been a name change there. I think, but I would also say what's changed in even the vice president's language and what you saw in the president's AI executive order is more language and attention to workers and to the fact that people are concerned about these systems. So you don't have to call it AI safety. You don't have to agree with one of the lineages of AI safety that comes out of what people might call AI kind of doomerism. But I think that even this administration has sort of come around over the last certainly 6 months to a position that says people are concerned, people on the right are concerned, and that government should be thinking about adoption and about people feeling more comfortable with these tools and technologies as they're being rolled out.
Okay. Um, I'm just not going to ask any more questions because I see. No, I get your points because I'm framing things a little bit the way they're framing it, and they're playing down where they're getting involved. But the question is, how does this work relative to the way things we were doing before? Are they learning it? Is there, hands-on involvement and, getting into these companies and, having a guy like David Sachs, sort of there in the White House and having his people or having people like Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen so close to the president. Is that helping U.S. competitiveness and AI development?
It's helping a few in U.S. competitiveness and AI development. I mean, it really is, the challenge about the moment and about the Trump AI policy is that it's picking winners and losers in ways that we say that we don't in a free market. And so the proximity of leading figures from Silicon Valley, from the VC space and the tech development space, means that they are getting larger shares of this market, and for themselves. And you said, the president is I think, what did you say? Something that framing like a AI stock buyer or something.
Yeah.
I think the United States, the country, the American public is now also put in the position of being an AI stock buyer. But the president gets to be the stock picker, and those around him. And so I think, it's just been interesting to watch the conversation change. David, you'll remember, 10 months ago, 12 months ago, people like Mark Andreessen were lamenting the fact that there was being quick market consolidation in the AI space and what to do about little tech, what to do about the small startups, the small, VC projects that people were trying to spin up to diversify the ecosystem. But now that pendulum has swung, and to the extent that you can get a startup, you've now got this pathway now for M&A, for mergers and acquisitions, that you maybe didn't have before. And so people are less worried about having, I think, tangible, healthy, small tech ecosystem, and, much more concerned or much more focused on having the companies stand up just enough so you can acquire them and sort of move M&A.
Yeah, which by the way is, and I say this with some degree of confidence, is being less regulated and less
Yes.
policed than
Yes.
it was in the past.
Yes. Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
in terms of stimulating innovation in the United States, in terms of the competitive environment, they talk a lot about it. To the president himself, well, this is a very hot thing. AI is very hot. We're investing in it. Um, uh, but there is some question as to whether it's actually working. It's some question about whether, well, some policies that are carryover from Biden policies, like restricting the sale of chips, is actually helping. And a week ago, we had the Chinese announce their 5-year plan,
Mm-hmm.
and the centerpiece of the Chinese 5-year plan was technological independence. It was kind of like, well, we're not going to be dependent on your chips. We are not going to be dependent on you in all these ways. And I'm just wondering, should we be rethinking this idea of, sort of heavy export controls and so forth, and acknowledging that competition is sort of getting ahead of our ability to regulate it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in any instance, even not just for semiconductor chips, that export controls as a tool of governance or to shape markets is only also, ultimately adding friction. It's never a stop. It's a sort of temporary stopgap. It doesn't often sort of completely, transform the entire market. So I think that and I think that the Biden administration certainly went into export controls around chips, I think understanding that, to be clear, because that's just widely known. I would say, I think what was unanticipated is, and then I think this is how we need to like sort of reframe how we think about innovation. What was unanticipated is the fact that the constraint, to the extent that the export controls did create sort of constraint and barriers to Chinese R&D or Chinese developers working more freely, the constraint actually was a source of innovation. And so this was that DeepSeek moment that we had a few months ago when it's, from what we know, it seems clear that there was, less compute, less energy. You don't need those chips. You might be able to use other kinds of chips. So the constraint is also creating unwittingly an ecosystem that's much more diversified, much less dependent on these particular chips, and arguably much more innovative. And so I think that's going to be continue to be the sort of back and forth with this. And if you don't have an answer for that, I think export controls are not going to work at all.
Um, yeah, and also, I mean, I think another part of this is, I don't know, so maybe it's a predisposition among some Americans to say, well, we are innovative. The rest of the world, we're this is our special sauce. We are very good innovators. But the reality is the rest of the world has always been good innovators, and
Yeah.
the Chinese, the people I talk to with AI are like in China are like, no, in some areas they're ahead of us.
Yeah, I think listen, not having, I mean, you can think of lots of, I think, examples that have nothing to do with technology. When people have less, they're able to figure out a way out of no way, right? Which is a phrase kind of out of the African American tradition. And so that's just true. And I think we're creating these pockets of innovation by trying to constrain the hardware. So yes, I would also say that when you think about the sort of broader universe of AI, generative AI and large language models in the large universe are just a small piece of that. I mean, it's hard to imagine because they're the hugest piece in the kind of market ecosystem. But if you're talking about just the technology itself, so we're also, I think, risking in the United States the by focusing on this market that really emerges out of the United States and focusing on this one particular small aspect of AI and machine learning, all of the kind of innovation and other types of AI that might be being, developed and done. And so my worry is, yes, the United States, people in the United States have a track record of being deeply innovative, but we're also isolating our activity to a kind of one small domain, and that one small domain is also mostly kind of research and development being done by companies. And so, I think in China, you probably the ecosystem is a bit more diversified. People are working or throwing a lot more things at the wall. And I think there should be some concern if we're worried about American innovation and this sort of race with China, about how diversified our stakes are here.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to your original point and to show that I'm listening and that there are these kind of forms of regulatory intervention which are that are not labeled that way. Um, uh, and two of them that strike me as relevant on this is kind of the war on science, where we're sort of going against science funding, going against grants, and so on and so forth. And another one is the war on um, foreign students coming to the United States, but to study, or just the inability to give visas to people. And that if we want to innovate, isn't that like a direct shot at two of the big engines of innovation?
I 100% there. I agree. I won't disagree with you at all,
Oh,
David.
God, we're almost 20 minutes in. Finally, I get it. Oh yeah,
No, I mean, so this is what's so, I think, troubling and also inconsistent. And I think the messaging around the Trump administration, which, trumpets, wanting to sort of just drive and lead and dominate, right? Supremacy, right? Technology supremacy, and also, have gold standard science, the best in the world. So I would be the first to say, in my time in government, I came as a reformer. I understood that there were things that we were doing in science and technology policy that we could be doing better. So I don't come to the questions that you raise with a perspective like, keep everything the way it was. The status quo is amazing. There's certainly things that could change. But what we need to do to lead in this space, obviously, is to continue to be the world's leader as we have been, in scientific research and development. I mean, the entire ecosystem that we have right now comes out of this, not only in universities, but also in government research. And to the extent that I mean, we don't have a budget right now, so we don't know what exactly is going to happen. But what was proposed in the president's budget um, were diabolical. I mean, were just devastating cuts, more than 50% in some instances, between 40 and 60% to the science and research ecosystem. The ecosystem that gave us chips, that gave us, the internet, that gave us the iPhone, all of the things that the AI technologies of this moment are building upon, this foundation. And to sort of rip away that foundation just seems completely just short-sighted. And again, this is what, to go back to where we were talking before, there is a discourse, a language that is spoken about, commitments to science and technology. And then, I think some practices that don't support that.
when you look back at the Biden administration, what's your critique of that?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think we could have done a lot more to engage the public around science and technology. So if you think about what's happening now around public health and the way that vaccine distrust has sort of spun out in the public sphere, I think we could have certainly been better at engaging the public, being accountable to the public, really listening, and not, always saying the experts are, completely right and just, be quiet. We don't have anything for, there's nothing for you to say here. I'm spinning up a project with my colleague Jenny Reardon called The Public Science, which is trying to think about exactly this question. How do we learn from not just the last 5 years or 10 years, but even the last 80 years in which we created the science and technology policy ecosystem that we have now in the United States, and what might we do better? So we're early stage and we have more questions than answers, but I think certainly having much more public accountability, much more public messaging about the work that we're doing. I think we didn't, do ourselves any favors by being involved in, what turned out to be kind of two military struggles that are still intractable and ongoing. I think we didn't say quite enough about the big pieces of historic legislation that were passed that had everything to do with AI, the Chips and Science Act, things that enabled more broadband to have more people to have more access to technology more generally. So there's a few, but there's a big long list.
Well, there are some people out there, who are trying to influence the course of things forward. And I saw that you had written something about an initiative that basically had as its core goal how to help America advance faster on all of this, and 10 times faster.
Yeah.
And you made a good point, which is that faster is not always um, better. And in fact, in some respects, I would observe if you can't keep up with the pace of change, it becomes more dangerous. And I was wondering if you might talk about that a bit.
Yes, I wrote a kind of public response. Senator Rounds and Senator Heinrich issued, I guess what I mean in the government you'd call it an RFI, request for information, but they issued a kind of open letter asking to for comments about how to accelerate the American kind of innovation ecosystem. And my response, which I think is inherent, is not a bad idea. I think it's inherently a good idea. The question is, um, at this moment that we're living in which people are distrustful of institutions, distrustful of science and technology. Some folks are distrustful of big tech. We've got, news coming out about, possibility that engagements with chatbots lead to suicide, that large language models are causing people to be still to this day wrongly arrested. I mean, like there's just a lot of suboptimal, I think, examples of use cases of AI, even though there's also great promise. And is that what we want to accelerate? Like, do we want to have put some things in place to have a foundation that is the thing that we want to accelerate? And I worried that, because everyone's always yelling at DC, we're yelling at Capitol Hill, we're yelling at the interagency and the federal agencies that they're, not fast enough, not efficient enough, and all of that. I worried that in this framework, Senator Rounds and Heinrich were just kind of taking up the Silicon Valley move fast and break things ethos, and as if sort of being kind of jocular around the innovation ecosystem was going to be enough to make it true. So it's certainly the case that what is, I think, distinctly American is that we try things and we stop things and we try things. And there's a lot of us. I mean, we're a big country. So you don't want to be paralyzed and sclerotic, but I think there needs to be humility about this moment, because whether, wherever you are on the political spectrum, there's a lot of people that are in the American public who are deeply unhappy about where kind of science and technology and public health are. And to not listen to that, try to right size that a little bit and then accelerate from that kind of improved foundation seemed to me like a lost opportunity.
Yeah, no question about that. Now, another consequence of the administration's policies, where in some areas they're not as engaged, and in some areas they're directing it in ways that are uncomfortable for people, is that we're starting to see state and local regulation pick up, right? And so, in some respects, that's a good thing. It's happened in other kinds of industries as well. But for example, California is like, no, we're going to be out there, and this is the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world, and so that's going to be consequential. And I'd like you to talk about that, but also, I think there's a practical consequence to it, which I remember back in the olden days when I was in the Clinton administration as a trade official. We spent most of our time trying to harmonize
Yes.
global regulations so
Yes.
that people could say we can achieve scale because we don't have to come up with 180 different models for the world. Here, even in the United States, you're getting a regulatory checkerboard, which has got to be hard for the innovator and for the VC and for others who are saying, well, I can't judge the underlying value of this idea or this company if I don't know whether it's going to get to scale or if it's only going to scale in red states or California is going to be, et cetera. And I'm just wondering what your sense of this phenomenon is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard problem, but I would go back. I mean, let's talk about it from not just the perspective of the VCs, but from the perspective of policymakers in a state like California or a state like Utah, where they're doing also quite interesting regulation and legislation around AI. We've had 8 years, let's say, in which the federal government has not passed any legislation in this space, right? So not just the sort of 3 years since the evolution of generative AI in November of 2022, but we've had really no, depending on how you want to mark it. I mean, you could go back to the 90s. We've had no really meaningful technology legislation in a very long time. And in my time working in the Biden administration, we did get close with a four corners, bipartisan, bicameral attempt to have a Kids Online Privacy Act. And that even didn't kind of make it over the line. And there's been a couple of other gestures in that same space. So if you're a state policymaker and you have a constituency, either because they are the, literal, sort of groundswell like California of this industry, or you have people who are concerned about where these technologies might be leading, I don't think you can sort of honestly say to your constituency, we're going to wait, the federal government's going to take this on, right? I mean, I think it's just, there's just, recent history has shown that that's not the correct case. I think also given what the Trump administration has said about wanting to be deregulatory, et cetera, I think if you are a governor or you're a state legislator, I think you would be foolhardy to sort of think, okay, we're going to step back and hold back here because we know the Trump administration is going to come with some regulation that's going to deal with the fact that I have a constituency that's yelling at me every day about how concerned they are about the children and their communities and what these technologies, might mean. So I wanted to add that to the mix because certainly we don't want to staunch innovation. We don't, but I'd also say that companies deal with regulatory patchworks all the time. It is not ideal, and if we could have, exactly to your point, David, sort of policies that were harmonized not only at the federal and sort of state level but also globally, that would be amazing. Like what an amazing glide path for industry. But let's not act like it's not the case that our multinational corporations have to do this every day. It's part of the work that they do. So we want to make it easier and not harder, but it is not an impossible feat. That said, I think, we saw with the president's, with the brokering around the president's big, beautiful bill that's now passed into law, there was a moment in which, Senator Cruz sort of placed inside of the bill, preemption of state law. And in the end, I think there were some strange bedfellows that made that not the case, but there's still a lot of action and activity around not wanting to have this patchwork. I would say, we talk about the states as being these laboratories of innovation, of policy innovation. And to the extent there's going to be any appetite at all for doing anything at a federal level, I think it's not a bad idea to at least see what the states are doing and see if things work or don't work. I would say the states have been, in the case of California, I can't remember the name of the bill, but the legislation that just passed that was sponsored by Senator Weiner in the lead, that Governor Newsom signed around AI safety. I mean, there was an earlier version of that in the last legislature, and the governor signed an executive order that really gave shape to what this bill that he signed came to be. So there was also a process here in which companies were involved, VCs were involved, the academic research community in California was involved, and that they got to a space with a piece of legislation that I think everyone doesn't love, but everyone doesn't hate. And so let's see what happens, because in the space of the sort of gap, the lacuna left by federal action, I want to personally leave open the space for states to try to figure out things that work and don't work. And I think, California is an interesting figure because these industries, many of them are based there. That's their tax base, that's their constituency base. Like they don't want to kill these industries. And so I think California is a very important experimental, voice in this conversation.
Yeah, well, it's also, it's interesting in this respect, and we're running out of time, but we are. I am very interested in this state and local phenomenon, both as it applies at a sort of at a higher level, but also going back to your point, AI is not all generative AI. It's not all, the sort of the core theory of AI. In fact, increasingly, whether you're looking at it from the point of view of an AI company or a VC or just a consumer or person, it's applied AI. And applied AI manifests itself in a lot of ways. It could
Yep.
be a traffic camera that recognizes you and can compare where you've been to where you've been in the past, and the federal government is not going to be dealing with that, but a lot of states are going to be dealing with that, and all of a sudden questions come up about privacy and security and so forth, and that's just a tiny slice in every in the creative arts, that there's a whole set of issues that are associated with how AI uses existing content, how intellectual property, and what it does with it, and so forth. And I think you know Washington is. I think we could both agree not super highly functional at the moment, and so it's going to just leave a lot of this to other places to
Yes,
address.
exactly that. Exactly. I mean, the lack of regulation is other people, sort of, I think, filling it in, and that's what's happening. So we think of laissez-faire and a kind of, um, the way that we were taught in college or in high school about laissez-faire, that it's just kind of this, bold, letting the ecosystem figure it itself out. But the lack of action, or what the ecosystem doesn't figure out on one end, is happening on the other side. And so, I guess to go back a little bit to where we began, even doing nothing around AI or is making choices about what this ecosystem is going to look like. And I think the state and local level is saying, again, if you're not going to do something, we're going to do something, not only because we can, but because also we're being compelled by, folks that we are accountable to do something. So, I think I think the federal government, I think the Trump administration is trying to have it both ways, trying to both saying, we're going to do something, but we're also not going to do something. And, it's creating, I think, I think a confusing terrain. And the last thing I'll say, David, is, we're starting to get to the Trump OSTP, led by Michael Kratsios, released an RFI on how to, how the government, the Trump administration, should be looking at deregulating AI. So are there barriers across the federal government that are causing difficulty, for the sort of innovation to sort of advance? And I think it just closed yesterday. So I've just been looking at a couple of them over the last 24 hours. And, you've got the, organizations from public health, like the American Hospital Association and others in that space, basically saying, like, we actually want regulation. Like, we want, like, we're in a place right now where it's not clear what the rules are. So, one of the RFI response letters that I read said, we're not sure if we need to be following we want to harmonize to the HIPAA guidelines, right? So you have a whole sector that's on these health privacy regulations. And it's like, if you guys are going to do things, harmonize everything to this. And so what's fascinating is, like, not that these professional associations were asking for less regulation. They were asking for clarity around regulation, and knowing that adoption in the healthcare sector by their patients and clients is going to take a level of regulation in which people feel comfortable, and a continuation of norms that are already established.
Wow. I got to tell you, every time we talk, I learn a lot. Every time we talk, the time goes by far too fast. So every time we talk, I'm left wanting more. So I really hope that we can get you back and continue the conversations. We're about to, with our, some friends from MIT Technology Review and some other universities, begin to do a bunch of live conversations about this stuff,
Fantastic.
including one in DC. So hopefully we can convince you to come and join us at those as well.
Would love to
Uh,
see you.
it would be great to see you. But for now, Alondra, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if you like what you heard, keep joining us here at Cell Consciousness, or go to the DSR Network and click on membership, support what we're doing here. For now, thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important.